Gun violence is preventable, but when elected officials refuse to stand up to the gun lobby and protect our community, it becomes inevitable, and it's costing lives. I've witnessed how gun violence doesn't just shatter families, it shatters entire communities.
She buried her little boy on a Wednesday, and 5 days later, the town buried her. What began with a child's tragic accident ended in a mother's violent death outside a downtown restaurant. This isn't fiction. It's the true story of Kaylynn Davidson, a mother consumed by grief, a feud ignited on social media, and a confrontation that spiraled into gunfire. How did a week of mourning turn into another funeral? Tonight, we uncover the heartbreaking case that shook South Bend. She buried her little boy on a Wednesday, and 5 days later, she would be buried beside him. This is not the opening to a crime drama. It is the true, devastating timeline of one mother's grief and the bitter chain of events that followed. In the span of a single week, a South Bend family lost first a 5-year-old boy, then his mother. The moments between were raw, painful, and tragically human. Public grief, social media fights, and a confrontation that spiraled into fatal gunfire in downtown South Bend. The names many now remember are Kaylynn, often called Kane, Davidson, and her son Kyler. And the shooting took place outside the restaurant where strangers tried to help and emergency crews rushed in. The community still asks, how did a private heartbreak become public violence? Kaylynn Davidson was a mother known to those close to her as loud, proud, and fiercely protective. Those who loved her described a woman who lived in the moment, who posted loudly and loved fiercely, who defended family and pushed back against anyone she felt had wronged her. To Kyler, she was everything: anchor, champion, and comfort. To friends, she was quick to laugh and quick to confront injustice. She was also human in all the messy ways that grief would later expose: raw, vulnerable, and at times overwhelmed. These are the human details that make the loss so piercing. Kaylynn's social media, her voice in message threads, the small videos mothers post to record a child's laugh. Those ordinary touchstones of modern family life became the public record of a private life undone. Kyler Nolan Davidson was 5 years old. He was a child described by family as brilliant, ahead of his peers in reading and play, a boy with curiosity and energy. His smile, the family said, brightened their days. In a late April 2022, a routine drop-off at a relative's home turned into a family catastrophe. A young child, a 9-year-old nephew, somehow accessed a gun that was in the house, and a single shot struck Kyler while he played outside. He was rushed to the hospital, placed on life support, and the family faced the impossible choice of withdrawing care. On May 4th, 2022, Kaylynn and the family removed Kyler from life support and mourned the presence that had filled their home and hearts. The local reporting and law enforcement statements about the initial shooting make one thing clear: the weapon was at the home and was not secured so that a child could not find it, a detail that would echo through the family's grief and in the anger that followed. Grief in many families does not stay private. It is posted, shared, amplified, and sometimes it turns outward. In the days after Kyler's death, Kaylynn's social media posts were unfiltered and raw. She publicly grieved. She publicly blamed. She demanded answers, and she lashed out at anyone she believed had failed her son. A street-side memorial that friends put up for Kyler, flowers, balloons, and toys, was vandalized, and for a mother already broken, the act felt like a fresh wound. In a short period, public grief bled into public conflict. A feud with another woman, which had simmered for months on social media, now intensified in the open and in person. Small conflicts, insults, videos, calls-outs, do not commonly end in death, but in this case, the intersection of open grief, a social media beef, and real-world anger would set the stage for the next tragedy. Local communities reacted as communities often do, with shock, sympathy, and rapidly forming narratives. Neighbors brought flowers. Online commenters debated motives and culpabilities. Reporters documented a mother who mourned publicly and then walked into a confrontation that would cost her life. For many who watched from the outside, The storyline was almost incomprehensible. First, a child's accidental death in a family home, then the mother's funeral, then her own killing, all within a week. As the facts were collected, civil authorities and prosecutors would be forced to distinguish tragedy from crime and grief from culpability. The rest of this story follows the days leading up to that fatal confrontation, the shooting outside the downtown restaurant, the arrest, the trial, and the sentence that followed. On April 30th, 2022, a day that started ordinary for many families, became the pivot for years of grief. Kaylynn dropped her 5-year-old son Kyler at his grandmother's home on Woodbine Way in South Bend, a place where children played, snacks were set out, and grandparents watched over grandchildren. The home was a place of comfort for the family, and the presence of relatives gave the mother peace. But inside the house was an unlocked risk, a legally owned firearm that, according to investigators and family accounts, was not properly secured. A child found it. The results were immediate and catastrophic. Emergency crews were called. The child was taken to hospital where medical staff fought to save him. Days later, with no hope of recovery, the family made the unbearable decision to remove life support. The details the police later confirmed left the community stunned. A gun had been present in a home with young children, and a mistake like that can end a life in an instant. The ways people grieve are personal. Some retreat, some rage, some post on social media. For Kaylynn, grief was not private. She poured sorrow and anger into posts and live videos. She wanted answers. She pointed blame directly at the circumstances that allowed the gun to be accessible. The mix of grief and anger can harden into resentment when people are searching for accountability, and online communities can amplify that anger. Kaylynn's posts were raw and direct, the kind of posts that invite response and sometimes retaliation. Her pain was visible to anyone who followed her. It became the public landscape of her life. That visibility intersected with a simmering feud. Within the local social scene, Kaylynn had clashed previously with another woman, documented arguments and insults back and forth in public channels and sometimes offline confrontations. The other woman, Kamari, Wright, had a public profile and was known locally. The social media exchanges could be petty, but they were public, and with the family's grief already raw, any perceived slight became magnified. Then a small act of vandalism against Kyler's street memorial, balloons slashed, flowers scattered, became the moment that pushed Kaylynn into public outrage. Anger pushed toward a need for confrontation. Weeks of online antagonism had been building toward a face-to-face moment. Ahead of May 17, 2022, just days after Kyler's funeral, word reached Kaylynn that Kamari would be at a downtown restaurant. What followed was a volatile mix of sorrow, anger, and opportunity. A mother who had just performed the final rites for her child, still raw and exposed, drove into downtown to confront one of the people she believed had sinned against her family. Some witnesses would later say Kaylynn walked into the restaurant and confronted Kamari directly. Witness accounts vary in the precise moments, but all accounts agree. What began as a confrontation quickly escalated. The eyewitness reporting that followed filled in the outline. Words were exchanged, a scuffle broke out, and what should have ended in shouts ended with gunshots. Outside the restaurant that evening, patrons and bystanders watched in horror as violence overtook argument. People scrambled, phones recorded, and 911 was called as the sound of gunfire cut through a city night. Paramedics arrived quickly. Kaylynn was struck multiple times as she fled. Her body was removed to hospital where doctors worked to save her. The city learned the cruel reality. A mother whose boy had died days earlier had now been shot and would not survive. Authorities took a suspect into custody at the scene. The case that had started as grief and argument had turned into a criminal prosecution. Reporters on the ground captured the chaos, families gathered, and the community took in the scale of the loss. Law enforcement moved fast. Officers at the scene detained the woman reported to have fired the shots. Within hours, local media reported that a suspect had been arrested and taken into custody. Police statements and preliminary reporting identified the shooter as Kamari Wright. She was booked and charged in connection with the fatal shooting of Kaylynn. Investigators described the sequence in which a scuffle turned into a deadly use of a firearm in a public place. The initial charges included counts related to the killing, and the state prepared to pursue a serious prosecution given the public nature of the shooting and the fatal result. The early press coverage framed the incident in the broader narrative of a community shocked by two deaths in quick succession. From a prosecutorial perspective, this was a case of escalation. The proximate facts were not in dispute. A physical confrontation occurred, a woman was struck by bullets outside a downtown restaurant, and a suspect had been taken into custody. But the legal issues that would occupy the court for months were more nuanced. Was the shooting a lawful act of self-defense, or did it cross the line into criminal homicide? Did the defendant pursue the victim after the scuffle ended? What did the surveillance footage show? What did eyewitness testimony say about who had thrown the first blow, who retreated, and whether the killer chased down the victim? For prosecutors, the fact pattern suggested more than an act of defensive panic. For defense counsel, the story of a threatened person reacting to an attack would be central. Those competing narratives would form the axis of the upcoming trial. Investigators compiled statements from patrons, staff, emergency crews, and friends. They reviewed surveillance footage from the restaurant and nearby cameras. Evidence collection at scenes like this is painstaking. Gunshot residue tests, forensic trajectory analysis, the chain of custody of the firearm used, and the testimony of the first responders. The prosecution also examined digital footprints, the social media exchanges and messages that showed the feud's escalation in the weeks before the shooting. Those posts would later appear in court as context. A broken mother publicly consumed by rage, social media antagonism that had gone viral in a small city, and a confrontation that had been building on a public stage. Meanwhile, Kaylynn's family confronted the double grief of losing a child and a mother in short order. The community supported them with vigils and posts. Friends collected donations and offered condolences. In the legal system, the case moved forward. A formal indictment, plea hearings, and pretrial motions would follow as attorneys lined up, and jurors were later called to reckon with a case that combined grief, public conflict, and a fatal shooting. As press coverage continued, the story raised larger questions about guns, grieving publicly, and whether a small online feud could spiral into deadly violence. By the time the case reached trial, the public narrative had already formed around two competing images. On one side stood a mother destroyed by grief, who had confronted a woman she believed had wronged her family. On the other stood a defendant who would claim she acted to protect herself after being attacked. The prosecutor framed the case in stark terms. This was not a reasonable self-defense. Rather, it was an act of vengeance and escalation. Surveillance and witness testimony, the prosecutor argued, showed that Kaylynn was fleeing when she was shot, a fact that turned legal self-defense on its head. The prosecution pointed to the use of a gun in a public space and argued the defendant's actions endangered others and made the killing criminal. The defense presented a different picture. Counsel emphasized the chaotic, high-emotion scene and contended that their client had been attacked. In violent confrontations, the defense argued, split-second reactions can feel like life or death. If the defendant reasonably believed her life was in danger, the defense said, her use of force might be lawful. They also challenged witness credibility and stressed that fights are dynamic. The person who lands the first punch is not necessarily the person who feels most threatened. In court, the defense sought to transform a prosecution about escalation into a story of fear and self-preservation. The jury heard surveillance footage, listened to eyewitnesses, and weighed forensic detail. Crucial moments turned on ordinary human things: the angle of flight, whether bullets struck from behind, whether the gun was aimed at a fleeing person, and how quickly the defendant ceased firing. Prosecutors placed the killing in the context of the weeks of online taunting and the vandalism of a memorial, painting a portrait of anger that did not justify a lethal response. The defense painted Kaylynn as the initial aggressor who approached and struck the defendant, making it difficult for a bystander to draw the clean lines the prosecution sought. The judge had to ensure both sides could present context while instructing jurors on the narrow legal definitions that governed their deliberations. When the jury retired to deliberate, the community waited. The family that had already buried a young boy and then lost a mother demanded answers. The friends and advocates who had rallied for Kaylynn earlier now saw her case tested by the slow mechanics of the court. And for the defendant, the stakes were enormous. A murder conviction could mean decades behind bars. A manslaughter conviction, a still serious prison term. For a region still processing the shock of the initial tragedies, the trial was a grim reminder that private grief can lead to public consequences and that justice must parse the human mess that lies between. When the jury returned its verdict, it reflected the difficult balance between empathy for grief and the law's constraints on killing. Reporting shows the jury found the defendant guilty of voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, a verdict that signals a recognition of partial culpability but stops short of the most serious homicide finding. Jurors accepted that the defendant's actions took a life and were criminal, but they did not unanimously find the highest degree of malice or premeditation that would support a murder conviction. After the verdict, sentencing proceeded, and the court imposed a multi-year term. Local accounts indicate the sentence was 10 years with credit for time served, a punishment that would nevertheless allow for the possibility of release earlier under certain conditions, a reality that divided opinion in the community. Reactions were mixed and intense. For Kaylynn's family and friends, no sentence could repair the double loss they had suffered. A mother who had lost a child, and then her own life could not be returned. And those closest to Kyler and Kaylynn decried the result as insufficient. Online, commenters argued about proportionality and accountability. Others, meanwhile, focused on the root causes. How did a child gain access to an unsecured firearm? How could grief be better supported in communities so that it does not metastasize into public violence? Advocates for victims of gun violence use the case to press for safer storage laws and for community interventions that can diffuse online feuds before they turn into real-world fights. Legal experts using the case as an example noted how modern conflicts often begin online. Social media permits disputes to be amplified and syndicated across friend networks. And where humiliation feeds anger, humiliation can incubate retaliation. The line between a social media beef and a violent response is not often this short, but when one party is grieving, the probability of escalation increases. Raw emotion, sleep deprivation, and the trauma of loss all lower the threshold for impulsive, risky behavior. Prosecutors called attention to the fact that firing into a public space is reckless and dangerous. Defense counselors warn that juries must account for human fear. The law tries to draw precise lines in an imprecise human landscape. For the Davidson family, public attention has been a mixed blessing. Support poured in for the funeral and memorials, and community groups raised awareness about gun safety and grief counseling. Yet nothing returned Kaylynn or Kyler. Family members have expressed the desire that their pain spur changes, better gun storage in homes, more resources for grieving parents, and the fact that public fights on social media need not lead to real-world violence. The case remains a cautionary tale for communities nationwide. Grief can be the seedbed of conflict. An unlocked gun can be tragedy in waiting, and words typed in anger have consequences when bodies are nearby. When headlines fade, the scars remain. Kaylynn and Kyler are buried together, and the family carries their absence forward. The legal system delivered a verdict and a sentence. The court process closed one chapter, but could not restore what was lost. For community leaders and local advocates, the story catalyzed conversations about gun safety, about support systems for grieving parents, and about the dangers of public humiliation on social platforms. For friends and neighbors, the story remains a raw memory of 2 funerals in 1 month. If we step away from the news cycle and the courtroom, what remains are human truths that are hard to legislate away. Grief is messy. Human beings sometimes make dangerous choices when they are raw with pain, and social media can make small slights feel like public betrayals. Yet there are actionable lessons here as well. Secure your firearms. Invest in timely grief counseling and community support after a tragic event. Teach de-escalation and provide safe spaces for disputes to be mediated before they turn violent. Local groups use the case to push for programs and offered resources to families who lose children in accidents. Small steps that can, over time, save lives. Finally, the case asks a quiet moral question. How do we as communities respond to raw grief? Do we meet broken people with patience and aid, or do we amplify their pain by turning it into spectacle? Kaylynn's life, as a mother who loved loudly and fought fiercely for her family, deserves to be remembered with compassion, and her story should invite policy changes that protect children and support families in crisis. The more we understand the human threads that lead from an unlocked gun to a vandalized memorial to a fatal encounter in a restaurant, the better we may become at preventing the next tragedy. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe the verdict was fair, or should the punishment have been harsher? Share your perspective below. And if you want more in-depth true crime documentaries, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thank you for watching.